1994. 1994. How many of you guys remember that year? It's a pretty good year. I think I was 13 years old. 13, maybe 14 years old in 1994. And my mom and dad, and some of you are like, really? Yes, I am that young. It was 1994. My mom and my dad had decided to take the whole family to go see this new epic cartoon that has just come out called The Lion King. And, it was, for me, it was probably my favorite cartoon growing up as a kid, as a teenager. The Lion King was, pretty epic at the time with the graphics. I mean, of course, today we have much more amazing graphics, but the graphics of Simba running with the wildebeest and they're running towards you. And if you remember, I mean, it was just pretty powerful, pretty awesome. Well, The Lion King earned about $422 million in North America alone that year. And today it is the 29th highest grossing film of all time. It's the 7th highest grossing animated film of all time, and its release, along with companies, an extensive marketing campaign, Burger King, Mattel, Kodak. You guys remember Kodak? Wow. Nestle, Payless shoes, all of its merchandising ended up netting Disney over $1 billion. And of course, The Lion King has a great story of a young kid, a young soon-to-be king. His father, Mufasa, of course, is killed, and he goes on this crazy, epic journey with a couple of hippies named Pumbaa and Timon, who are out there, and they sing Hakuna Matata, and means no worries, and they eat bugs like every hippie should, and it was just a great time until finally he meets Rafiki, the priest bamboo guy, and shows himself an image of himself in the lake, and it's his father there that kind of comes through, and he's reminded of his identity, that he is the natural heir, that he is the rightful king. And of course, he makes his way back, and Pride Rock, and Matza Peña, and they're lifting up the lion, and it's pretty awesome. Well, like the Lion King, I think many times we as believers have a tendency to forget who we naturally are. We end up on weird journeys where we shouldn't be. We end up maybe even into sin. And we forget that we are rightful heirs of the throne, that we are children of God, that we are called and made in His image. And that ultimately, at the end of the day, we as believers serve the real Lion King, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And today, in Daniel chapter 6, we get to really probably one of the most epic stories in all of the Bible, of course, with Daniel and the lion's den. And Daniel will remind us today that our identity is not found in being a statesman. Our identity is not found in being a nice guy, but our identity is found in really our relationship with the Lord, and how we live that out and how we take a stand for Jesus will ultimately sometimes get us into trouble, but at the end of the day, God will always be glorified. And so, if you're taking notes this morning, I had to just go with it. I've titled this morning's message, The Lion King. And we'll be looking at 4 points. And like I said, I had to go with it. So we're just going with it. Verse 1 through 9, we'll be looking at the circle of life. That your life should circle Jesus. Your relationship should always be in proximity to Jesus. Number 2, verse 10 through 17, be prepared. If you remember the song, be prepared, okay? So be prepared that when your life circles Jesus, you've got to be prepared for the persecution that will come. But at the end of the day, when the persecution comes, you don't have to worry. So our third point, verse 18 through 23, Hakuna Matata. It means no worries. That you don't have to worry because God is on your side. And when God is on your side, verse 24 through 28, you can feel the love tonight. Just letting you know. I just had to go with it. I mean, just letting you know. Now, if this is your first time, you're probably thinking this is a weird church. But I just like to set the scene so we're all moving in the right direction. We are in the Old Testament book of Daniel in a series that we've titled Defying the Status Quo, or really bucking the trend, how to live above the crowd, not just survive in this world, but thrive in this world. And the book of Daniel really epitomizes that in the sense that Daniel's life, I mean, he was a guy that bucked the trend. He didn't conform to the things of this world. In chapter 1, he starts off by saying, I am not going to conform. I'm going to purpose in my heart not to defile myself. And throughout the book, we see him learning. We see him growing. He serves 6 kings during the course of his life. He is taken at the age of 14 as a young prisoner of war from Jerusalem. He will never see his friends again. He will never see his family again. He is taken to Babylon. Most scholars believe he is made a eunuch at that time. And then he will serve these 6 kings, and he will serve them faithfully, but not because he's serving them, ultimately because he's serving God. He's serving the Lord, and he won't conform, which is a biblical calling, as Romans tells us, that we are not to be conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of our mind. And through this, Daniel shows us how to live for the Lord, how to strive for the things of God, how to buck the trend, how to defy the status quo. And throughout the book of Daniel, just some history with it, 2 things, 2 major themes. Number 1 is the sovereignty of God. Through this, you see God working throughout the book. The first 6 chapters focuses on the man, you could say. It focuses on the prophet Daniel. And then chapters 7 through 12 focuses on the message or the prophecies of the prophet. But yet through this, the second theme is, how do you live for God in Babylon? How do you live for God in the things of this world? How do you live for God when the world system around you doesn't conform to the things of God? How do you buck the trend or break the status quo? How do you be transformed and totally changed? And that is really played out in Daniel's life. And so this is where we're picking up. Last week, if you were here with us, a king by the name of Belshazzar was on the throne. And God had spoken in this amazing handwriting on the wall, what we call divine graffiti, that the handwriting came on and it said, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, which literally was, you've been weighed, you've been measured, you have been found wanting, your life is going to hang in the balances tonight, you're going to be given over to the Medes and the Persians. And Daniel predicts this and tells the king, and that very night, even according to archaeological history, the Medes and the Persians conquered the Babylonian Empire, and now it becomes the Persian Empire, or the Medo-Persian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson Belshazzar, the party was over, and what we see today is Daniel will faithfully, consistently, or faithfully professionally, or faithfully under scrutiny, or faithfully spiritually now serve a new king. There's a new boss in town, a king by the name of Cyrus, and his, what you would call maybe vice scepter, a guy by the name of Darius. So notice our first point. Let's just look at the kind of circle of life we'll see here. Chapter 6, verse 1 through 9. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself among the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. And so these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdoms, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which do not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. What we see through this first section in Daniel chapter 6 is a faithful man. Someone who is very faithful. Proverbs chapter 20, Solomon says, most men will proclaim his or own goodness, but who can find a faithful man? Faithfulness is one of the key marks of a true believer. A long faithfulness in the same direction is a key mark of a true believer. We as brothers and sisters in the Lord are called to be faithful. Of course, we sing, great songs like "Great is Thy Faithfulness." I read of a story of a husband and wife. The husband and wife, this husband, he was faithful to his wife. He loved his wife dearly, but for some reason she was very, very jealous and always, suspected him of bad behavior. He worked in an office where he wore suits, and when he would come home, she would search his suit, and she would find a blonde hair and would accuse him of having an affair, and then he would come home and the next day and find a brown hair on his suit, and she would accuse him of having an affair, and he would always consistently, honey, I love you, no, I care for you, no, and so he finally wised up, and he bought a kind of lint brush and decided to clean himself up, and he came in and was ready to give her a kiss, and she looked and looked on his suit and didn't find a single hair, and he went to give her a kiss, and she pushed him away and said, "Get away from me, I can't believe that you're having a fling with now a bald woman." Who can find a faithful man? God has found a faithful man many times. In Moses, Numbers 12 tells us, Jesus says, well done, good and faithful servant. Finding faithfulness, it's a big thing. It's one of the reasons why we call, for example, Old Faithful in Yellowstone faithful. It's not the biggest geyser, it's not the most powerful geyser, but it's consistently always on the clock. Well, Daniel chapter 6 is all about this man who will serve the Lord faithfully. His life circled around the things of God. His life circled around the Lord. And here we're introduced to a guy by the name of Darius. Well, we met him last week a little bit, but we'll get a little bit more into Darius. There's not a lot of secular history concerning Darius. We know Cyrus was the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, what we know of today as modern-day Iran. It was a massive empire that swept its way through, conquered the Babylonians, made its way all the way through to modern-day Turkey and what we know of today as modern-day Liberia and so on. It was a huge empire. And there are 4 or 5 Dariuses throughout all of history, but none of them are mentioned as early as this. And so at present, technically speaking, there is no archaeological records of Darius who took over the Babylonian Empire under King Cyrus. However, some scholars do see a connection with a general in the Medo-Persian Empire by the name of Gabaru. And Gabaru was King Cyrus's kind of right-hand man. And after the initial invasion into Babylon, Gabaru led the Persian forces into the capital city. He was born in 601 BC, and we know that the fall of Babylon happened in 539 BC, which would make Gabaru 62 years old, which if you'll notice in chapter 5, verse 31, it says, "And Darius, the Mede, received the kingdom being about 62 years old." Now, I mentioned this because we talked about this last week, that sometimes it takes a little bit of time for archaeology to be found. Right now, currently, only 1% of ancient Middle Eastern archaeology has been discovered. They're still finding new things every day. And so, for example, like last week, the name of Belshazzar, the king, had never been mentioned in the archaeological digs, and yet people viewed the Bible, mocked the Bible, scoffed at the Bible because, well, we know that there was no king named Belshazzar in the Babylonian Empire. That was until 1854 when they found what we believe and know as the Nabopolassar cylinders. And the Nabopolassar cylinders tell us Nabopolassar, this long prayer for Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon, and his son, Belshazzar. And so that's when Bible and archaeology add up. So I mentioned this because technically today there is no archaeological evidence for a guy by the name of Darius. Some scholars would like to put Gabaru as that guy. But the word Darius simply means one who holds the scepter. One who holds the scepter. So King Cyrus could have set up Gabaru to rule over the province of Babylon under the title Darius, one who rules the scepter. So now archaeology might discover a Darius, but until then, Gabaru is a good, strong possibility. That's just for you history nerds that like to watch the History Channel, and that's just for you. That was free. So what we see here is Daniel is given a prominent position amongst the governors. Seems that there would be 120 satraps, and there would be 3 governors to rule over. These governors, Daniel was one, and these satraps would have to give an account to the governors. They would have to kind of up the chain of command so that King Darius, the vice scepter, would only have to deal with 3 guys, not 120 guys. Daniel's made the chief of the staff, administrative governor. And Daniel would have been a safe choice. And the reason being is because, well, he was very familiar with the customs and the traits of Babylon. He had no real allegiance to Babylon. His allegiance was really to Jerusalem, but most importantly to the Lord. Daniel lived a life where he knew he had dual citizenship. He was a citizen of Babylon, but more importantly, a citizen of heaven. Ultimately, a citizen of the Medo-Persian Empire, but more importantly, a citizen of heaven. In the same way that you and I are, yes, citizens of the United States, but more importantly, we're citizens of heaven. It's been said that some Christians are so heavenly minded that they are no earthly good. In other words, that there are some Christians who are content to just sit around and wait for the rapture to happen. They jump up and down practicing waiting for the rapture to happen. Or they go to the other extreme and they live their lives in such a way that is reckless, where it's like, well, we're waiting for the rapture to happen. We're waiting for Jesus to come back, so we're going to put everything on the credit card and buy everything that we want and live our lives in complete debt. Or we isolate ourselves and hunker down and move away from people so that we don't have to be around people. But Jesus said that we're to be about the Father's business. Both positions are improper views of dual citizenship. Jesus taught that we're not to be of this world, but we are to be in this world, living our lives in this world, serving as ambassadors and as shining light. And Daniel is a great example of that. He's living for the Lord in a very pagan place. He's carrying out his duties and responsibilities. He's being faithful. Remember, Daniel at this time is about 85 years old. Since the age of 14, this is really all he's ever known, living in this pagan society. He's been in Babylon for 70 years. He's been captive there. He's lived there since he was a teenager. And yet through this, he gets to serve ultimately 6 different kings. One king comes, another dies, another one is risen up. And here he is being faithful over the things, serving, yes, his earthly king, but ultimately his heavenly king. And at the same time, he never compromises through this, his morals and his faith, his beliefs. Notice chapter 6, verse 3, it says, he distinguishes himself, that there was an excellent spirit about him. I mean, what a great description to have, that oh, you have such a great, excellent spirit. You have a good countenance about you. Some people naturally have this by their personality. They're great to be around. The rest of us can pray that by God's grace we would have an excellent spirit about us. Sometimes, many times as believers, we have a tendency to look a little bit more grumpier than we should. We have scowls on our faces, and I tell you guys this all the time. It looks like we've been baptized in lemon juice. We just, it's the whole if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Well, if you're happy and you know it, tell your face. Because it would be good for us to show that we have an excellent spirit about us. That the love and the grace and the mercy and the joy of Jesus Christ rules and reigns in our hearts. And that was Daniel. He had an excellent spirit. He distinguished himself. And the governors and the satraps didn't like that. Now, why didn't they like that? Well, the problem was, of course, jealousy. Sometimes that takes place if you work in a business environment and someone gets a promotion and you think, well, I work longer, I'm here, I'm early, I stay late, and they get the promotion. Sometimes jealousy. Could be anti-Semitism. Of course, we've seen that throughout the course of history when it comes to the nation of Israel and the hatred of the Jews. It could be that these governors, these satraps and governors they would lose money. And sometimes that's really what it comes down to. Being in charge of these jurisdictions and these provinces, Daniel would have been in charge of roughly 40 provinces if he was one of the 3 governors. He would have been in charge of 40 provinces, which means that during those provinces would have however many people in it, which means you can then tax however many people. And if you can tax those people, then you can skim off of the top and, kind of cushion your pockets or line your pockets. And it could be the case that these satraps didn't like the fact that Daniel was probably an honest man. And, they couldn't line their pockets anymore, so they started plotting to take him down. Something interesting, about Daniel's work ethic, his character and his integrity, his loyalty, is he distinguishes himself with this excellent spirit. And he wasn't the kind of person that goes about walking around with his head down, always bummed out, complaining. He wasn't like, these people I have to work with, griping, I want to go to HR, nothing like that. Daniel had an excellent spirit, and nothing could be found to discredit him. Here's what's interesting. Here's a man who is powerful. He's a political figure, and there's no corruption. Lord Acton once said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You've probably heard that saying before. And yet here's Daniel with the most absolute power and no corruption. Yes, there's controversy, but no corruption. What's the controversy? Chapter 1, he wouldn't eat food that would defile himself. Chapter 2, he told the king that there's another kingdom coming. You're gonna be deposed. Chapter 4, he would tell the king that he was prideful and that he was going to run around like a wild animal with mad cow disease. In chapter 5, controversy. The controversy was that he was a party pooper. He didn't join the party. They brought him to the party after the party was pretty much over, told them about the writing on the wall, all this controversy, but yet there's no corruption. He distinguishes himself. And so the only way they can get him is by attacking his religion, his relationship with God. This was the place where Daniel was always consistent. His life always circled the things of God. His life always circled a right relationship with God. He was never going to compromise. And in their minds, they say the only way that we can get him is if we get him concerning the laws of his God. So they set up a trap. And they tell the king, hey, king, let's have it so that no one worships any other god or man but you for 30 days. Knowing that Daniel can't worship any other god but his God. Here's the thing, was the Medo-Persian Empire, once a law came into place, you couldn't change it. So for example, in the Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar was pretty crazy. He was always like changing his opinion, changing his ideas, going up, going down, just writing a new law, doing different things like that, and it could be changed. But the Medo-Persian Empire, once the law was set into motion, it had to be followed to the T. The king's law could not be altered, although God was going to do something about that here. Now, think about what they're doing. They're seeking to take the power that has been given to them to serve the people. They want to take the power and use it to take away from the people. And so the decree is made. Daniel is to be thrown into the lion's den. Why? Because he refused to change. He refused to compromise. Notice our next point, verse 10, to be prepared. It says, "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his window open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God." Notice this, "as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. 'Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?' And the king answered and said, 'This is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which do not alter.' And so they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree which you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed." And so the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel, and they cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke to Daniel, "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Then a stone was brought and laid at the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of the lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Notice what happened. Daniel hears the news, and immediately he goes down to Hobby Lobby and buys some poster board and starts picketing. No, right? No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't picket. He doesn't protest. What does he do? He just prays. Why? Because what does it tell us? That was his custom since the early days. He's not being ostentatious. He's not trying to buck the crowd or the trend. He's just being faithful to the things that he's always done. He lived with his windows open towards heaven, but ultimately even here towards Jerusalem. And he's not praying towards Jerusalem or to Jerusalem, but the God of Jerusalem. King Solomon dedicated the temple. And in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 46, it says, "When your people sin against you and you become angry with them and deliver them to the enemy and take them to the captive land of the enemy, far or near, yet when they come to themselves in that land where they've been carried off and repent and make supplication to you in that land of those who took them captive, saying, 'We have sinned and done wrong and have committed wickedness,' and when they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies, who led them away captive, and pray to you towards their land which you gave to their fathers, the city which you have chosen, and the temple which I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their supplication." Daniel was just doing what King Solomon had predicted. King Solomon said, "One day, God, we know that there's going to be some people and they're going to take your people captive. But when they decide to repent on that day and pray towards the city, pray towards Jerusalem, please hear their prayer and supplication." That's what Daniel was doing. He was just saying, "Lord, hear my prayer, hear my supplication. I'm looking towards Jerusalem. I'm not praying to Jerusalem, but I'm looking to you towards Jerusalem where your holy temple is." And he had done this 3 times a day. Notice, 3 times a day. I wonder if, as my voice cracks, I wonder if our hearts and our lives, how different we would be if we decided to pray 3 times a day. Not just before our meals, like, "Dear God, thank you for this Chick-fil-A. We know it's Christian chicken, but, it's awesome, and no, but more than that. I read through this, and I'm personally convicted about this. Notice it says it was the custom since his early days. I read through this, and I'm filled with personal conviction, because sometimes you have to preach at yourself. If you're a pastor, you should preach at yourself. Because I think of all the lame excuses I've had over the years of not being consistent or faithful. But dear God, I need my beauty sleep. I mean, I need my beauty sleep, or I exercise at that time, God, or really, just one more Netflix, just one more. Just one more episode. And I think of all the faithful people in our own church when I'm making excuses of not being consistent, of getting up and praying and reading my Bible and doing the things that I should, and think of man, maybe there's so many people in our own church that are consistent and faithful that many of you will probably never know. The groups that gather together to pray before church, or those that serve faithfully by coming in and cleaning every week, or those that take the prayer requests that you guys put in the agape boxes, the offering boxes, and pray for them, or the lady in our church who prays over every single one of our missionaries every single day. The faithful ones. The ones that have, notice, it's been the custom since the early days. Faithful men and women doing the things that God has called them to do. Praying. That's what Daniel did. He just prayed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much, James chapter 5 tells us. Jesus said in Luke 18 that men ought always to pray and not lose heart. And so here's Daniel, 85 years old. It was a dumb law that the king signed into law. It was a dumb law. But Daniel didn't complain. He didn't freak out. He just went and prayed and did the things that he had always done. He stayed faithful even in the midst of that. Daniel, I don't think, realizes, or maybe would even realize, the powerful impact that his story would have on many of us. Because for many of us, the story of Daniel is a very powerful story. God didn't put this in the Bible just so that Sunday school teachers have something to teach about. He put this in the Bible in the same way he put David and Goliath in the Bible, or Elijah being fed by the ravens, or the times of Jericho coming down. True stories that happened and took place, not to teach us an archaeological, intellectual exercise or anything like that, but to stir up in our hearts to be men and women who are faithful. To be men and women who would step forward and say, listen, life isn't always fair. But yet, if you remain faithful, if you're prepared, if you serve the Lord, if you honor Him, life isn't fair, but man, God works and moves for the people who serve Him and honor Him. That when you take a stand for Jesus, you can be guaranteed that Jesus will be there standing with you. Life isn't always fair. I heard the story of two men who were in the waiting room. Both of them were expecting fathers. Their wives were having babies. And the nurse came out to one of them and said, "Congratulations, you have a brand new baby daughter." And the other guy stood up and said, "Well, that isn't fair. I was here first." And the nurse said, "Yeah, but his wife delivered first." What's happening to Daniel isn't fair, but he doesn't get delivered from the experience of the lions, and he will go through it. Like David, when David says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," the valley of the shadow of death isn't always fun. For us in the Christian life, we like the mountaintops when things are great, and we come to church and we get goosebumps, and yeah, things were awesome, and the coffee was good, and we go home and we had a good week, and we didn't cuss this week, and yeah, we're doing good for Jesus, and everything's great, and yet when the valleys come, and the hardships come, and the trials come, and the storms come, we need to remember that the battles belong to the Lord. For Daniel, he knew, well, I'm going to pray. And even if I have to go to the lion's den and through the lion's den, I will not have to freak out or worry. Notice our third point, verse 18 through 23, Hakuna Matata. It says, "Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. And no musicians were brought before him. Also no sleep went from him. Also his sleep went from him. And then the king arose early in the morning and went in haste to the lion's den. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. And the king spoke, saying to Daniel, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?' And then Daniel said to the king, 'O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, so that they did not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." And now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he believed in his God. The lion's pit in those days was really just a big circular hole in the ground with a movable wall in the middle. And they would keep the lions on one side, and they would put food on the other side. And of course, these lions weren't well fed. They were ferocious and hungry. And so Daniel had to spend the night there, but he didn't have to worry or freak out. The king was freaking out. It was a Persian custom to that the death and or execution should be carried out before nightfall. So this probably happened, of course, in the course of a single day. They knew that Daniel was devoted to his God, and they knew that his love for his God would always be paramount, so they exploited that. And here, persecution we see is inevitable. You and I are going to go through persecution as believers. There's going to be times of persecution in our lives. Paul would put it this way: anyone who desires to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. And so here the death sentence has been passed. Daniel is taken to the lion's den. And here's what's interesting is he remains silent. The text is silent. It's like Jesus when Jesus was brought before Herod. And he's laughing and mocking him. And it says that Jesus doesn't say anything. He just doesn't say anything. And the story here kind of reminds me of another story according to church history. In 156 AD, there was a guy by the name of Polycarp. And Polycarp was an early church father. He was the a Christian leader of the church of Smyrna. And he was the Christian bishop there. And they tied him to a stake, and they were going to light him on fire. And the executioner said, "Listen, Polycarp, you can get out of this. Just deny Jesus, and we'll let you go, and you'll have your freedom." And Polycarp didn't start yelling and freaking out and saying, "I hate flames," or "I don't want to die," or any of those things. He just simply said, "I served Jesus Christ for 86 years, and never once has he denied me. He's never done me any wrong. How can I deny him now?" And Polycarp looked down at those flames and looked at them as the will of God for his life. And that really was the case for Daniel. Daniel didn't freak out. He didn't punch back. He didn't try to run away. He didn't beg for mercy or anything like that. He didn't say, "I hate teeth. I hate lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, I don't like these things." No, he just simply said, "Lord, if this is your will, 86 years I've served you. If this is what's going to happen, I'll take it." And this becomes kind of the central question in our lives. Is our God able to deliver us from bad things? The answer is yes, but he doesn't always do it. Sometimes you have to go through the lion's den. Sometimes you have to go through the storm. There are times in our lives when you do have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And I look at this section and think of it like as a movie, like here's Daniel, just Daniel being lowered into the lion's den, and then it cuts to the king. And the king's like tossing and turning, and he can't sleep. And I think, first things first, I don't care about what's going on with the king. I want to know what's going on with Daniel in the lion's den. But here we see Daniel is dependent on the Lord. It reminds me of his three friends in chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stood in the fiery furnace, and Jesus showed up. Daniel knew that God could deliver him, but even if not, here he goes. "Oh well, hi lion. Just take it." And I love this. When the time came, it says the king said, "Daniel, has your God delivered you?" And Daniel said, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel." I love this. God not only closed the mouth of the lions, but he also sent an angel to keep Daniel company. How cool is that? I mean, could you imagine that conversation? That's one of those moments I'm going to TiVo in heaven when we get to heaven. It's going to rewind that. I want to know what they talked about. I want to know what they were talking about. But here's Daniel. He was found innocent. Nothing bad, and yet in the midst of this, he still had to go through the lion's den, but God would deliver him. And lastly, because he didn't have to worry or fret or fear, notice verse 24. Can you feel the love tonight? It says, and the king gave the command, and they brought those men that accused Daniel, and they cast him into the den of lions. Them, their children, their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. And he has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus of the Persians. Notice the critics, the ones that came up against him, were thrown into the lion's den. And ultimately, well, the lions were stuffed with them. Why their families? You probably might ask the question. It was the law of the Medes and the Persians, and it couldn't be altered. Crime worthy of death, your whole family was typically punished as well, so that no one would come back and seek revenge. And so here, we're not told of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den with family. And the reason being is probably because there's no record of him having a family. Remember, he was most likely made a eunuch when he was brought to the Babylonian Empire in Daniel chapter 1. But then God would raise him up. There's this decree. Everyone shall serve the God of Daniel, and God delivers him. Here's what's so amazing is this one man who purposed in his heart not to defile himself against the things of God affects empires. Nebuchadnezzar he reigned under, Belshazzar he reigned under, a few other kings in between that. Here, Darius the Mede in the Medo-Persian Empire. And I've always believed, of course, that Daniel's influences extended beyond, way beyond his time alive even, in the Babylonian Empire. Remember, it tells us in chapter 2 that he was made head of the Magi. You guys remember the Magi were the guys that came and saw Jesus. Remember, they brought some gifts to Jesus in the Christmas story. Do you think maybe Daniel tipped them off that maybe the Savior of the world was going to be born a few hundred years later? If he was in charge of the Magi, I mean, his influence over these two kingdoms and even over history, I mean, it doesn't take much, or it doesn't take a lot of people to do the right thing. It just takes the right ones. People who are willing to stand. And when you're willing to stand for the things of God, when you're willing to take a stand and live, man, you can influence a nation, you can influence a family, you can influence a power, you can influence a business. When you're willing to do what's right, what's good, what's honorable, like Daniel did. His life circled the things of the Lord, and he always stood for the things of God. And I'll close by telling this story, and then we'll get into our application points. There's a story of a guy by the name of George Bolt, B-O-L-D-T. And George Bolt managed a little hotel in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Not much. He was a good manager, though. And one evening, a couple made their way in to the hotel and asked for a room, and George Bolt said there was no vacancy. There was a big convention in Philadelphia at the time, and what happened was all the hotel rooms really in the entire city were taken up, and travel was up, visitors were thick. I mean, there was just not a single vacancy. And George knew that if this couple left their hotel room or left the hotel, they wouldn't find a room anywhere else. And so he decided, you know what, you guys can have my room. I'll sleep on the couch in the foyer. I'll sleep on the couch in the foyer. You guys have my room. I'll make sure you guys are taken care of. And they were like, no. Like, we'll just, and he said, no, you're not going to find anything out there. Just take my hotel room. I insist. And so they took the room and they spent the night. And as they were checking out, this elderly gentleman said to George Bolt, you know, you're a good manager. You take care of the people that come into this hotel. I mean, man, you should manage the best and most amazing hotel in the world. I'm going to build one for you. And George was like, ha, yeah, that's totally funny. That's great. Until a few years later, George received a letter in the mail from this elderly gentleman in New York. It was that man, and reminded him of the story, and he asked George to come to New York. This is a true story, and to visit him for a few days. And inside the envelope was also a ticket so that he could get there. And so George made his way to New York. Downtown, corner of Manhattan, downtown New York City. And he looks up and there's this beautiful hotel. And the elderly gentleman walked out. The elderly gentleman's name was a guy by the name of William Waldorf Astoria. And he asked George to take over his hotel, knowing that he was going to be a man that was faithful. He was going to be a man that would get the job done. Sound familiar? If you decide to be faithful, to stand, to do what's good and what's right, in the end, God will always be glorified. In the end, God will always be glorified. And even if you have to go through the lion's den or go through the trials or go through the pain and go through the suffering, even though maybe you might not even be relieved on this side of eternity, in the end, God will be glorified, where if you have to suffer through cancer and the cancer isn't healed, one day your body will be healed for eternity. One day we'll be in heaven where there's no more pain or suffering. One day we'll be there where there's no more divorce, no more sickness. But we've got to be faithful. As we close, 3 things I'd like to take from this morning's message, and then we'll be dismissed. Number 1, be faithful. Just be faithful. Here's Daniel. He's been elevated to position, great prominence, integrity, served under many kings. His enemies were jealous. They hated him. But what did Daniel do? He didn't change a thing. As was the custom from his early days, he continued to be faithful. Even though the trap was set. Everyone in this life will face hardships. Everyone will face difficulties, but Christians have hope that no matter what, God will see us through. Sometimes life isn't fair, but at the same time, we've got to remember and understand that we serve a God who life wasn't fair to him. Think about Jesus. Was the death on the cross fair? Did the things he went through in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he bled, sweated blood, fair? There are going to be times of pain and sorrow. And it's so sad that for most people, their theology doesn't work when they need it most. Because if your theology is that Christians should always be winners, what happens when you lose? Or that Christians should always be healthy, what happens when you're sick? Or that Christians should always be rich, what happens when you're poor? Or that Christians should always be victorious, but what happens when you're defeated? Life isn't always fair. Jesus was dragged off to an illegal trial. There was nothing fair about his conviction or his death. And yet, 1 Peter chapter 2 tells us, but if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his footsteps. Life wasn't fair to Jesus. Life will not always be fair to us. But if we remain faithful, we win in the end. Number 2, there is a possibility to have peace amongst the lions. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. We're not given a testimony of what took place that night, except for that he had an angel there for company. None of us wants to go through the lion's den. I mean, those were normal lions. They were very hungry. It's not like they were miniature lions bred for captivity just to keep around as pets or anything like that, like a mini beagle or something. It's not what they were. They were real lions. And Daniel, I believe, probably because the angel was with him, got a good solid 7 hours of sleep that night. I mean, peace. There was peace. Real peace is being able to lay your head down on your pillow at night, at peace with God, committing your life to him, no longer plagued with the guilt, saying the words, Lord, I trust in you, and I'm going to go to bed. And many of us will feel the heat of the fiery furnace like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Some of us might have to go through the lion's den. Maybe some of you are here this morning and you're in the lion's den. You have enemies plotting against you for your destruction. You have an adversary, as 1 Peter tells us, who roams about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. You have an opportunity to have peace in the midst of that by simply placing your hope and your trust in Jesus Christ. The Bible tells us, and when you do that, you'll have a peace that surpasses understanding, a peace that it makes no sense why you should have peace, but you will. That you can have peace amongst the lions. And number 3, and we'll close with this, as believers, we have an opportunity to influence culture. Daniel influenced kings and kingdoms. Some amazing stories, and 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 tells us that if you submit yourself to the Lord's sake, to every authority instituted amongst men, whether to the king as to the supreme authority or to the governors whom you are sent, you'll be lifted up. That when we decide to take a stand for God and do what's good, right, honorable, and pleasing in his eyes, living as a Christian in America, we're influenced by so much every single day, some negative, some positive, but consequently, we have an opportunity as well to influence the people you come in contact. Your Starbucks barista, the person that checks you out at King Soopers. You have an opportunity to influence and love and give a smile and tell them that Jesus loves you and tip extra not because the service was phenomenal, but because you're a good Christian. Don't be the one that just leaves a track. That doesn't feed people. But to love and to show the goodness and grace of Jesus. And sadly, many Christians don't use their influence for God's kingdom. Not all people are brought to Christ through direct evangelism. It starts with an example. And again, Daniel influenced kingdoms positively. And while we as Christians today might not ever be able to have influence in changing laws like Daniel did, our influence can still be used for the glory of God. Why? Because we serve the ultimate true Lion King, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the one who roars into eternity, the one who rules and reigns forever. We serve him, and we can influence those around us.